Australia has more coastline than almost any country on Earth, but it's not the coastline that hides secrets. It's the inside, the wetlands, the billabongs, the floodplains that turn to mud for half the year and swallow whatever walks into them. Some of these places have never been fully mapped, not properly, not on foot. And here's the thesis we're going to test tonight. Extinction isn't always a fact. Sometimes it's just a label. Science slaps on an animal the moment it stops looking for it. We've explored 8 cases where that label might be wrong. 8 creatures Australia officially lost. In swamps, Australia never finished searching. And by the end, we'll get to one of them that scientists have already started bringing back. Not in a story, in a lab, with real cells, dividing right now. Let's start at the edge of the map, where the evidence is thinnest, and work our way toward the case with the most proof anyone has ever gathered. Number 8. The Yowie. Picture a stockman on a cattle station near the Gold Coast hinterland, 1978, checking a fence line at dusk along the edge of a swamp-fed creek. He hears something break a branch about 8 feet off the ground. Not 4 feet, 8. He doesn't wait around to measure it properly. He just runs. That's the kind of report that built the Yowie's reputation. Brief, physical, and always near water. Witnesses describe something close to 2.5 meters tall, roughly the height of a standard door frame stacked on top of itself, and heavy enough to leave depressions in soft mud that don't match any known Australian animal. No bears exist on this continent, so there's no easy misidentification waiting in the wings. Whatever people are seeing, they're seeing something that, on paper, shouldn't be there at all. The story goes back further than colonial Australia, though. Aboriginal oral traditions across multiple language groups describe a large, hairy, upright being tied to remote scrub and wetland country long before European settlers arrived. So this isn't a myth that started with a single spooked farmer. It's layered, generational, and geographically consistent with the densest, wettest, least walked terrain in eastern Australia. Here's where it gets strange. In 2014, a grazier in northern New South Wales set up a trail camera near a swamp to catch feral pigs. What it caught instead was a heat signature on thermal footage, upright, bipedal, moving through reeds at almost jogging pace. No pig walks like that, no kangaroo does either. But, and this is where the story usually collapses, no trail camera has ever produced a clear daylight image. Every piece of hard evidence is blurry, distant, or thermal. Skeptics point out that misidentified kangaroos, standing tall on their hind legs while grazing, have fooled plenty of witnesses in low light. Hoaxing has been documented too, including at least one confirmed costume stunt in Queensland in the 1990s. So the Yowie sits exactly where it's always sat, unconfirmed, unresolved, and impossible to fully dismiss. Still ask yourself, how many of these reports would exist if nobody who filed one had actually seen something? That's the shakiest ground we'll stand on all video. From here, the cases only get more concrete, starting with an animal science says vanished less than a century ago. Number 7. The Tulaich wallaby. South Australia's southeast, 1943. A grazier near the swamps around Robe reports a small mob of pale, elegant wallabies moving at dusk. Animals with a grace that made early settlers compare them to dancers. That sighting is the last widely accepted wild record. After it, officially, nothing. The Tulaich was never a large animal, about the size of a big dog, with a body built for speed rather than bulk, and distinctive dark and light banding across its back and legs that made it look almost painted. Early naturalists described it as the fastest and most beautiful of all the wallabies, which, as it turned out, made it the most desirable to hunt. Therefore, that beauty became the animal's death sentence. Fur traders and sportsmen pursued it specifically because of its markings, and at the same time, the swamps it depended on were being drained for sheep pasture. Between the hunting and the habitat loss, the population collapsed in barely a few decades. By the 1920s, it was already rare. By the 1940s, officially, it was gone. But here's the twist. In the 1970s and again in the 1990s, graziers along the Victoria-South Australia border reported small, pale wallabies moving through flooded paddocks near remaining swamp remnants, animals that didn't match the common red-necked wallaby in size or color. In 1972, a set of unusually banded tracks was cast in mud near Bull Lagoon and sent to a state museum for comparison. The results were inconclusive, close, but not a confirmed match. Still, wildlife officers who investigated the sightings were cautious rather than dismissive. Their most likely explanation was misidentification. Young, red-necked wallabies can show lighter coloring than adults, especially in poor light. No DNA sample has ever confirmed a living two-lake, but no one has ever fully closed the file either. One extinct wallaby, gone in living memory, its last strongholds drained into farmland. What happens when the animal in question isn't decades gone, but tens of thousands of years gone? And the evidence keeps refusing to sit still. Number 6. The Diprotodon. Lake Calabana, South Australia. A dry, salt-crusted swamp bed that fills with water maybe once a decade. In 2019, a station owner walking the lake bed after a rare flood spotted something pale breaking through the cracked mud, a curve of bone too big to be cattle. It turned out to be part of a Diprotodon skeleton, one of dozens found at that same site since the 1890s. The Diprotodon was the largest marsupial that ever lived, roughly the size and bulk of a small car, or a rhinoceros standing on 4 thick legs, built like an oversized wombat that never stopped growing. It grazed across ancient Australian floodplains and lake margins in herds, leaving footprints that modern paleontologists still find preserved in dried mud layers. Officially, the Diprotodon died out around 40,000 years ago, somewhere in the overlap between a drying climate and the arrival of the first humans on the continent. So the causes braid together, and scientists still argue over which one mattered more, the changing rainfall or the new predator walking upright on 2 legs. Here's the twist. Some of the Lake Calabana remains are preserved in conditions so good, mud-sealed, low oxygen, almost saline-pickled, that a handful of researchers in the early 2000s raised the possibility that certain specimens could be more recent than the standard dating suggested. Swamp preservation, they argued, can be so effective that bone looks fresher than its true age. But the mainstream response has been consistent and firm. Radiometric and stratigraphic dating across multiple independent sites all converge on the same window, tens of thousands of years ago, not hundreds. The freshness is a preservation effect, not a chronological one. Still, the fact that Diprotodon bones can look almost recently deceased after tens of millennia tells you something important about what these swamps are capable of hiding, and for how long. If a swamp can keep a 40,000-year-old skeleton looking freshly buried, what else might it be keeping just out of sight, closer to the surface? Number 5. The Paradise Parrot, Southern Queensland, near Gayndah, 1927. Naturalist Cyril Gerard photographs a pair of paradise parrots near a termite mound close to a waterhole, the last confirmed photographs ever taken of the species alive. Within a few years, official reports stopped entirely. This was not a plain bird. Picture something roughly the size of a small pigeon, but colored like a fragment of stained glass. Turquoise crown, scarlet belly, deep blue wings. A bird early settlers described as looking almost too vivid to be real. It nested in the mud-hardened termite mounds that dot Queensland's drier floodplain country, which made it dependent on very specific ground conditions to breed at all. So when introduced cattle overgrazed the grasslands, when drought hit hard in the 1920s, and when feral cats began working through the ground nesting colonies, the paradise parrot lost its nesting sites, its food, and its safety net all at once. Therefore, its collapse was fast, and by the time anyone tried to intervene, there was almost nothing left to save. But the story doesn't end at 1927. Unconfirmed sightings kept trickling in for decades. A grazier near Miles in the 1960s, a birdwatcher near Mitchell in the 1990s who reported a flash of turquoise and scarlet near a dry creek bed. BirdLife Australia has funded organized searches based on these reports as recently as the 2000s. Here's the catch. Every organized search has come back empty, and the leading counter-explanation is a case of mistaken identity. The mulga parrot and the blue bonnet, both still common in the same regions, share overlapping colors and can flash similarly in fast, low light. No specimen, no photograph, no feather has surfaced since 1927. Still, the searches keep happening, funded by people who think the last confirmed photograph wasn't actually the last living bird. A parrot that vanished in plain daylight is one kind of mystery. What happens when the creature was never confirmed to exist as a normal animal in the first place, only as a story that refuses to die? Number 4. The Bunyip, the Australian Museum, Sydney, 1847. A strange, bony skull, reportedly recovered from a swamp near the Murrumbidgee River, goes on public display, and thousands of people line up to see what newspapers of the day are calling proof of the Bunyip. The skull later turns out to be a deformed foal, but by then, the legend has already outrun the correction. Descriptions of the Bunyip vary wildly, depending on who you ask and which billabong they're standing near. But common threads run through nearly all of them. Something roughly the size of a large dog or a small seal, with tusks, dark fur, and a booming call that carries across still water at night. Aboriginal oral traditions describe it as a real and dangerous inhabitant of specific waterholes, long before any European ever wrote the word down. Here's the theory that keeps this case on the list. Some researchers argue the Bunyip isn't folklore invented from nothing. It's cultural memory. Australia's megafauna, animals like the diprotodon and the tusked, water-loving Zygomaturus, went extinct within a window that overlaps with early human occupation of the continent. So a story describing a large, tusked, water-dwelling creature might be an oral record of an animal that genuinely once existed, passed down for tens of thousands of years after the animal itself disappeared. Still, the more grounded explanation gets real support too. Bull seals occasionally travel far up Australian river systems in flood years, turning up in freshwater lagoons hundreds of kilometers from the coast, an animal completely unfamiliar to inland witnesses, with a bellow loud enough to carry across a swamp at night. Add cassowary calls, drifting logs at dusk, and a few centuries of campfire storytelling, and you have more than enough material to build a legend without needing a living relic at all. So which is it? Inherited memory of something real, or a very old case of mistaken identity that never stopped being retold? Either way, we're done with folklore. From here forward, every case on this list left behind a body, a photograph, or a living cell. Number 3. The Night Parrot, Western Queensland, Spinifex Country, 2013. Wildlife photographer John Young sets a camera trap near a remote waterhole after years of searching, and it captures something no living person had documented in the wild for over a century. A small, ground-dwelling parrot, alive, moving through the Spinifex at night. The night parrot is tiny, barely the size of a budgerigar, with mottled yellow-green plumage built for exactly one purpose: disappearing completely into dry grassland the instant it stops moving. It's nocturnal, almost entirely ground-based, and famously reluctant to fly unless directly threatened, a combination that makes it one of the hardest birds on Earth to find on purpose. So when confirmed sightings dried up after 1912, ornithologists didn't necessarily assume the bird was gone. Many suspected it was simply doing exactly what it had always done, staying hidden in country nobody was walking through carefully enough. Therefore, the extinction here was arguably always more about human search effort than about the bird's actual survival. Here's the twist, and this is the one case on the list where the twist isn't rumor, it's confirmed fact. After the 2013 rediscovery, follow-up expeditions found additional populations in multiple remote parts of Queensland and Western Australia. Researchers have since fitted individual birds with tiny radio trackers, and conservation reserves have been established specifically to protect known populations. The counterpoint here isn't about the bird, it's about the credibility of some of the people involved in later expeditions. whose claims in unrelated cases have drawn scrutiny from other researchers. But the core fact stands independently of any one individual. A species declared functionally extinct for nearly a century turned out to be alive the entire time, simply better at hiding than anyone gave it credit for. If a bird can vanish from scientific record for 100 years and still be alive the whole time, doesn't that change what extinct is even supposed to mean? The next case takes that same question and pushes it somewhere science has never gone before, from finding a survivor to building one back from scratch. Number 2. The gastric brooding frog. A university laboratory holding tank, 1983. The last known living Rheobatrachus, a frog with one of the strangest reproductive systems ever documented in any vertebrate, dies without ever producing a wild successor. Within months, the species is gone, and for over 30 years, that was the end of its story. The frog itself was unremarkable to look at, small enough to sit comfortably in the palm of your hand, mottled brown, easy to miss in a rainforest stream. But its biology was extraordinary. The female swallowed her own fertilized eggs, shut down her stomach acid completely for the duration of gestation, and gave birth through her mouth. No other animal on the planet reproduces this way. That same rainforest stream habitat in Queensland's mountain ranges is exactly what doomed it. The chytrid fungus, a pathogen that devastated frog populations worldwide, starting in the late 20th century, combined with habitat degradation and the gastric brooding frogs population crashed so fast that conservationists barely had time to react before it was gone entirely. But here's where this case stops being a ghost story and starts being a lab report. In 2013, researchers on Australia's Lazarus Project, led by paleontologist Mike Archer at the University of New South Wales, took preserved genetic material from frozen tissue samples and used it in a cloning process called somatic cell nuclear transfer, implanting the extinct frog's DNA into the donor eggs of a living, related frog species. The embryos didn't survive past the earliest stages of cell division. So no, there isn't a living gastric brooding frog hopping around a lab in Sydney. But those embryos did contain dividing cells carrying the extinct frog's genome, actual biological material from an animal declared extinct 30 years earlier, functioning again, however briefly. The project is ongoing. The hurdles that remain are real. Finding the right surrogate, understanding epigenetic barriers, science still doesn't fully control. We've gone from a swamp creature that might be folk memory to a bird that turned out to be alive all along, to a frog that scientists have already coaxed partway back from nothing. So what's left for the number 1 spot that could possibly top bringing dead cells back to life? Only the one case with more sightings, more searching, and more scientific investment behind it than every other creature on this list combined. Number 1. The Thylacine, Beaumaris Zoo, Hobart, September 7, 1936. A cold night. The zoo's last captive thylacine, the animal keepers had nicknamed Benjamin, is locked out of its heated enclosure overnight by mistake and dies from exposure. No one at the time treats it as historic. It's just one more zoo animal from a species everyone assumes will simply keep existing somewhere out in the bush. The thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, was roughly the size of a mid-sized dog, with a stiff, low-slung gait and a set of dark stripes running across its lower back and tail. A marsupial built to look, at a glance, like nothing else on the continent. It was Australia's largest carnivorous marsupial, and it had already vanished from the mainland thousands of years earlier, surviving only in Tasmania by the time Europeans arrived. So why did it disappear from Tasmania too? A government bounty scheme paid hunters for thylacine scalps for decades, blaming the animal for livestock losses that were later found to be mostly caused by wild dogs. Habitat clearing and a mysterious disease outbreak likely finished what the bounty started. Therefore, by the time legal protection finally arrived in 1936, just 59 days before Benjamin died, it was already far too late. Here's the twist that's kept this case alive for 90 years. Since 1936, there have been well over 4,000 reported sightings across Tasmania and a smaller but persistent number on the Australian mainland. many of them clustered around remote wetland and forest fringe country. Precisely the kind of low-traffic terrain this entire video has been building toward. In 2023, cutting-edge ancient DNA techniques recovered thylacine RNA from a 130-year-old preserved specimen, the most intact genetic material ever pulled from the species. And an ongoing partnership between the University of Melbourne's Andrew Pask and the biotech company Colossal Biosciences is actively working to edit that genome into the living genetic material of a close marsupial relative, an attempt at genuine de-extinction, not just cloning from intact cells. But the honest counterpoint has to sit right alongside the hope. Wildlife officers investigating sighting reports overwhelmingly attribute them to foxes, wild dogs, and feral cats seen briefly in poor light. Animals that, at a glance, in the wrong conditions, can trick even an experienced eye. And critics of the de-extinction project point out that even a full success wouldn't produce a pure thylacine. It would produce a heavily edited hybrid, genetically close but not identical to the animal that died out on Benjamin's last cold night. Still, of every creature on this list, the thylacine is the one with a living research program, real funding, real recovered genetic material, and a real, if imperfect, chance of walking again. Not folklore, not a blurry photo, an actual genome being edited right now by scientists who think extinct doesn't have to be permanent. So here's where that leaves us. 8 cases, 8 wetlands, 8 animals, science filed away as gone, and in every single one, the file has a crack in it. Some of those cracks are thin, a blurry thermal image, an old newspaper clipping, a skull that turned out to be a horse. But some of them run deep enough that real laboratories, real universities, and real research budgets are betting that extinct isn't the last word after all. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in all this swamp mud. Extinction was never meant to be a wall. It was meant to be our best guess, based on wherever we happen to be looking and wherever we happen to stop. And Australia still has wetlands nobody has properly walked through. Not once, not ever. So the question isn't really whether these 8 creatures are still out there. The question is, how many places are left on this continent where extinct simply means nobody's checked recently? And what else might be waiting in the mud the day someone finally does? If this kind of mystery pulls you in the way it pulls us in, there's another one waiting for you right now. Just as strange, just as unresolved. Stick around, and let's go looking together.